Chapter 2, Series of Aggression. Why do humans show aggressive behavior? Aggressive behavior causes harm and suffering to individuals and groups on a large scale and incurs enormous social and material costs for societies. Therefore, it is critical to understand and explain why people engage in aggressive behavior, not least because identifying the factors that instigate aggressive behavior is a first step towards prevention. In this chapter, the most important theories will be presented and discussed in terms of their contribution to understanding the origins and causes of aggressive behavior. The purpose of this discussion is twofold. First, to highlight the diversity of approaches that have been offered to explain aggressive behavior, and secondly, to build up a stock of theoretical constructs pertaining to different aspects of aggressive behavior that can help us to understand specific forms of aggression addressed in the following chapters. Before we enter into the discussion of different theories in detail, Table 2.1 presents an overview of the major theories that seek to explain aggression as a form of social behavior. For each theory, the table presents its core assumptions about what causes aggression and a summary statement about its empirical support, which, of course, will be substantiated in more detail in the course of this chapter. Theories of aggression may be broadly categorized into two groups: biological theories, which look for the roots of aggressive behavior in biological processes and mechanisms, and psychological theories, which refer to mental processes to explain aggressive behavior. The approaches in the top half of Table 2.1 are based on biological concepts and principles, whereas the approaches in the bottom half of the table address psychological processes. Rather than seeing them as competing or even mutually exclusive, biological and psychological explanations complement each other, stressing different aspects of aggression as a complex form of social behavior. The next sections will introduce each of the approaches in turn, paying special attention to the answers they provide to two closely related questions. Is aggression an innate quality of human nature? How is aggression shaped in the process of socialization, and is it possible for aggressive behavior to be avoided or controlled? Table 2.1, Major Theories of Aggression, an overview. Okay, so under types of biological approaches, you have ethology, where aggression is conceptualized as an internal energy released by external cues, steam boiler model. The main database is animal studies and the empirical evidence. No support as a model for human aggression, but still popular in lay discourse. Then you have the biological approach of sociobiology. Aggression is conceptualized as a product of evolution through natural selection. The main database is animal studies and correlational studies in humans. And for the empirical evidence, there is support for correlational but not causal links. Another biological approach is behavior genetics. Aggression is conceptualized as transmitted as part of genetic makeup. The main database is twin and adoption studies. For empirical evidence, there is support for the predictive value of genetic similarity. Another biological approach is hormonal explanations. Aggression is conceptualized as influenced by sex hormones and cortisol. The main database is comparisons of violent and non-violent individuals. And for empirical evidence, there is some empirical support. Okay, the next grouping is psychological approaches. So the first one is Freudian psychoanalysis. Aggression is conceptualized as a destructive instinct. The main database is case studies. For empirical evidence, no quantitative empirical evaluation, but important source for the FA hypothesis. Another psychological approach is the frustration-aggression hypothesis, FA hypothesis. Aggression is conceptualized as a likely response to frustration, likelihood enhanced by aggressive cues. The main database is experimental studies. For empirical evidence, it's supported by empirical evidence. Another psychological approach is cognitive neo-associationist model and excitation transfer theory. Aggression is conceptualized as a result of affect elicited by aversive stimulation that is interpreted as anger. The main database is experimental studies. For the empirical evidence, it's supported by empirical evidence. Another psychological approach is social learning theory. Aggression is conceptualized as a result of reinforcement, either direct or indirect, observed. The main database is experimental and observational studies. For empirical evidence, it is supported by empirical evidence. Another psychological approach is social information processing models. Aggression is conceptualized as a result of social information processing, enactment of learned scripts. The main database is experimental and longitudinal studies. Empirical evidence, it is supported by empirical evidence. Another psychological approach is I-cubed theory. Aggression is conceptualized as a result of the balance between promoting and inhibitory factors in the situation. The main database is experimental studies. For empirical evidence, it is supported by empirical evidence. Another psychological approach is general aggression model, GAM, a meta-theory of aggression. Aggression is conceptualized as a result of personal and situational input variables eliciting affective, cognitive, and physiological responses. Main database is correlational, experimental, and longitudinal studies. In terms of empirical evidence, it integrates findings from different psychological approaches. Biological explanations. In this section, we look at 4 lines of research that refer to biological principles in explaining human aggression, namely the ethological approach, the sociobiological approach, the behavioral genetic approach, and the study of hormonal influences on aggression. This discussion is necessarily selective and cannot do justice to the impressive breadth of research on the role of biological factors in explaining aggression. For example, on the role of the brain in understanding aggression, and conclusions from animal studies for understanding pathological violence. The ethological view, aggression as an internal energy. Among the biological approaches to aggression, one of the earliest contributions came from the field of ethology, which is concerned with the comparative study of animal and human behavior. In his famous book on aggression, Konrad Lorenz, 1966, offered a model of aggression that dealt specifically with the issue of how aggressive energy is produced and released in both animals and humans. His core assumption was that the organism continuously builds up aggressive energy. Whether and when this energy will be released and lead to an aggressive response depends on 2 factors: the level of aggressive energy inside the organism at any one time, and the strength of external stimuli capable of triggering an aggressive response. In his hydraulic model, also known as the steam boiler model, Lorenz assumed that aggressive energy is produced continuously inside the organism until it is released by an external cue, such as the appearance of a rival in competition for a mating partner. If the energy rises above a certain level without being released by an external stimulus, it will overflow, leading to spontaneous aggression. According to this model, aggressive behavior is the inevitable consequence of the continuous production of aggressive energy. Even if it were possible to remove all instigating stimuli, this would not get rid of aggressive behavior. As Lorenz 1966 put it, such an attempt would be as judicious as trying to counteract the increasing pressure in a continuously heated boiler by screwing down the safety valve more tightly. Steam boiler model. Part of Konrad Lorenz's theory of aggression, assuming that aggressive energy is produced continuously within the organism and will burst out spontaneously unless released by an external stimulus. Although Lorenz regarded aggression as a permanent and inevitable feature of human nature, he saw the possibility of releasing aggressive energy in a controlled and socially accepted way, e.g. through sports activities. In this way, he thought it would be possible to keep levels of aggressive energy below the critical threshold above which spontaneous outbursts of violence and other highly destructive forms of aggression would occur. As Lorenz believed, the main function of sports today lies in the cathartic discharge of aggressive urge. When applying this model based on animal studies to human aggression, it has to be explained why the inhibition against killing members of their own species, widely observed among animals, clearly does not generalize to humans. Lorenz argued that strong inhibitions against intraspecies killing were not needed in the early history of mankind, when fists and teeth were the only, relatively innocuous, weapons for attacking one another. With the development of ever more sophisticated and lethal weapons, the fact that there is no innate inhibition to counterbalance the potential for destroying one's own species could give rise to uncontrolled levels of aggression and violence. The application of Lorenz's findings from animal studies to human aggression were soon considered problematic. An important criticism is directed at the implication that once the internal reservoir of aggressive energy has been used up by an aggressive act, it is impossible to trigger another aggressive response for as long as it takes the organism to rebuild a sufficient energy level. Sadly, there is ample evidence from school shootings and other instances of multiple killings that humans can perform several aggressive behaviors in quick succession, and that one aggressive act often serves to precipitate rather than suppress further aggressive acts. Neither of these observations is compatible with the depletion effect assumed by the steam boiler model. Furthermore, Lorenz's belief in the cathartic release of aggressive energy through sports activities is contradicted both by a large literature on sports aggression and by research debunking the catharsis hypothesis. Given that there is little support for Lorenz's ethological model as an explanation of human aggression, you may wonder why it has been presented here at all. The reason is that it still remains widely popular in everyday discourse when people suggest explanations and indeed cures for aggression. Enabling readers to participate in this discourse well equipped with critical arguments to challenge popular myths about aggression is one of the goals of the present volume. The sociobiological view: aggression as a product of natural selection. Sociobiology is concerned with analyzing the biological foundation of social behavior on the basis of the evolutionary principle of natural selection. This approach also offers an explanation of aggression in both humans and animals, focusing on the long-term, ultimate mechanisms that shape and promote aggression through the generations. Rooted in Darwin's 1859 theory on the origin of species, evolutionary theory is based on the idea that in order for a behavior to be genetically transmitted within a species, it has to be adaptive. Behaviors are adaptive to the extent that they increase the chances of survival of the species as a whole in the environment in which it lives. Sociobiology: discipline devoted to the study of the evolutionary basis of social behavior. Concise presentations of the evolutionary thinking about social behavior have been provided by Daly and Wilson and Buss and Shackelford. Applying the principle of evolution through natural selection to the study of aggression, aggressive behavior directed at fighting off attackers, as well as rivals in mate selection, is seen as adaptive in the sense of enhancing the reproductive success of the aggressor. Because they are better able to control access to female mating partners, the more aggressive members of a species are more successful in passing their genes on to the next generation, thus favoring the natural selection of aggressive behavior. Their genetic makeup slowly spreads at the expense of less aggressive and therefore less reproductively successful members. However, aggression may be a potentially costly and maladaptive behavior in certain cases. For example, attacking an opponent of superior fighting power entails the risk of being killed. Therefore, the functional mechanism seen as driving the evolution of aggressive behavior is a cost-benefit calculus. As it would be maladaptive to engage in aggressive behavior when the risk of being overpowered and potentially killed by the opponent is high, it is functional from the point of view of reproductive success to withdraw from confrontations that involve an opponent of superior strength and fighting power. Evidence cited to support the sociobiological account of aggression mainly comes from animal studies, which have been used to generate and test hypotheses about aggressive behavior in humans. For example, the observation that members of some species respond to cues indicating fighting power, such as opponent size, and refrain from attacking a stronger opponent, has led to the hypothesis that size and physical strength might be correlated with aggression in humans. Studies showing a positive correlation between height and physical aggression in boys and men support this line of reasoning. For example, Archer and Thanzami, 2007, found significant correlations between physical aggression scores on the aggression questionnaire, see Chapter 1, and body weight, R equals 0.25, as well as height, R equals 0.34, in a sample of young men. Arguably the most controversial contribution of the sociobiological approach in the aggression domain refers to its explanation of sexual aggression. From an evolutionary point of view, sexual aggression is an optional, if high-risk, mating strategy for those men who have limited opportunities for reproduction through consensual sexual relationships. This view implies that the potential for rape is part of the evolutionary inheritance of all males. It also implies that reproduction is the main function of rape, not in the rapist's conscious awareness, but in terms of the evolutionary significance of his behavior. To substantiate their arguments, proponents of the sociobiological explanation of rape refer to two main sources of data: evidence from animal studies of forcible mating behaviors in different species, and crime statistics, showing that the vast majority of rape victims are young women at the peak of their reproductive capacity, and that men of low socioeconomic status, indicating reduced reproductive opportunities by non-aggressive means, account for a disproportionate percentage of convicted rapists. Both data sources have been fundamentally challenged by critics of the sociobiological approach, Travis 2003, and the controversy is far from being settled. We will return to the arguments of both sides of this debate in more detail in Chapter 9. In summary, sociobiologists view aggression as a form of behavior that has evolved in animals as well as humans because of its potential to enhance an individual's reproductive success, thereby facilitating the selective transmission of aggressive genes to future generations. The fact that aggression is universally observed in human societies is seen as corroborating the evolutionary account, although differences between cultures in the level of aggression have been acknowledged. The evidence presented in support of the evolutionary account is largely correlational. For example, the covariation of physical strength and physical aggression, precluding statements about cause and effect relationships. Furthermore, alternative hypotheses may be advanced for many of the findings. For instance, the greater tendency of taller and stronger men to engage in physical aggression may be the result of learning through reinforcement in the individual's socialization history. Although evolutionary and socialization hypotheses are often discussed as incompatible, integrations between the two approaches have been suggested, such as the confluence model of rape, discussed in Chapter 9. By drawing attention to the roots of aggressive behavior in the ancient genetic heritage of the human species and explaining how it may be passed on through the generations, the evolutionary approach has made an important contribution to the theoretical debate about the causes of aggression. Behavioral genetics. Is aggression hereditary? The sociobiological argument that aggression has evolved because it is instrumental in enhancing the reproductive success of individuals and species rests on the assumption that aggressive behavior is transmitted through individuals' genetic makeup. This assumption is central to the field of behavior genetics, which is directed at exploring the role of genetic similarity in explaining similarities in personal characteristics and behavior. Specifically, behavior geneticists have sought to demonstrate that genetically related individuals are more similar in terms of their aggressive tendencies than individuals who are not genetically related. Because most children are raised by their biological parents, to whom they are also genetically related, the effects of nature and nurture normally coincide in individual development. Therefore, to separate the influences of family environment and heritability, special methods are needed. Adoption studies are capable of separating the influence of genetic and environmental factors by comparing individuals with their biological parents, shared genes, and with their adoptive parents, shared environment. If children are more similar in their aggressive behavior to their biological parents than to their adoptive parents, this is an indication that shared genes are more influential than shared environment. Conversely, if adopted children are more similar in aggression to their adopted parents than to their biological parents, this suggests a stronger role of environmental compared with genetic factors. A second methodological approach is provided by twin studies that compare identical and fraternal twins in terms of how similar they are in their aggressive behavior. Identical twins share 100% of their genetic makeup, whereas fraternal twins have only 50% of their genes in common. Therefore, evidence that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins in showing aggressive behavior would indicate that aggression is to some extent genetically transmitted. Behavior genetics, field of study devoted to the genetic basis of social behavior. Adoption studies, study design whereby the similarity between children and their biological parents is compared to the similarity with their adoptive parents to compare shared genes against shared environment. Twin studies, study design comparing identical and fraternal twins and how similar they are in their aggressive behavior.